A man carefully drills small holes in several cans, attaching them together with a piece of wire. He places the cans in various spots around his house, near the doors, windows, and hallway. It's an old-fashioned alarm system, but for Dan, it's reliable. The cans will make noise if anyone enters, alerting him long before they can get close. Later that night, as Dan sleeps lightly, he hears the faint rattle of the cans and his eyes snap open. Without hesitation, he grabs his gun from under his pillow and quietly slips out of bed. Moving swiftly through the house, he finds his two dogs already standing over an intruder who's struggling to get up as they have him pinned to the ground. Dan approaches the man and asks his name, but the man doesn't respond, so Dan kills him. Then Dan uses the man's gun to shoot a few times in the house, making it look like self-defense. Earlier, when Dan went for his regular checkup, the doctor told him that everything was fine. Despite this, Dan feels uneasy. Lately, he feels like someone is trying to harm him. When he returns from the doctor, he sees a mysterious man sitting in a cafe. Dan realizes that someone may be following him. To the untrained eye, Dan may seem a fragile old man, but the reality is that he is a former CIA operative. Decades ago, he went rogue during a covert mission in Afghanistan. After betraying a powerful Afghan warlord, Dan became a fugitive, hunted by both the warlord and the U.S. government. To stay hidden, he built a new life in a remote cabin in upstate New York with the wife of the warlord whom he ran away with. He lives off the grid, keeping to himself with his two loyal dogs, Dave and Carol, and his daughter Emily, whom he contacts cautiously by phone. After killing the intruder, Dan feels that his past has finally caught up with him, and he knows he must be more careful now. That night, Dan calls the police. When they arrive, he pretends to be a nervous old man who accidentally killed the intruder in self-defense. The police are suspicious because the man is well-dressed for a vagrant. He also has a gun with a silencer, which is unusual for robberies. The police suspect someone is targeting Dan, but he insists that he has no enemies and lived a peaceful life as a real estate agent in New York. He tells them the incident has caused him a lot of stress and he plans to visit family for a while. He offers them the key to his home so they can continue their investigation, and they believe his story. Once the police leave, Dan gathers his belongings and goes on the run again. He calls Emily and tells her that he'll be off the phone for a couple of weeks while he finds a new place to stay. Meanwhile, Harold, an old man, plays with his grandson Henry, who lost both his parents. Harold is the assistant director of the FBI for counterintelligence. That night, he gets a phone call from a man named Raymond. Raymond explains that he was assigned to capture Dan by the CIA, but one of his operatives was killed the previous night. Raymond wants Harold's help because Dan worked under him before disappearing. Harold is disturbed by this news but agrees to meet Raymond. That night, Dan goes to a diner, but memories keep flooding his mind. He remembers his younger self talking to his girlfriend, Balur. He recalls how they ran away from Afghanistan and promised to stay together until the end. Dan kept that promise. However, his sweet memory is interrupted when he gets a call from Harold. Harold tells him that he's not in charge of the operation, and the call is very secretive. He warns Dan that there's a transponder in his car. Dan quickly removes it and goes on the run, as Harold tells him he only has 3 minutes. After some catching up on the phone, Harold tells Dan that he's with a team of high-end contract operators at an airfield. There are others chasing him now, and their mission is to capture him alive and put him on a plane at the airfield, which Dan suspects will take him back to Afghanistan. Harold believes that Hamzad, the Afghan warlord, has convinced high-ranking U.S. officials to hand Dan over to him. Dan is suspicious about why Harold is sharing this information, but Harold warns him that if he gets caught, he will have to answer for things he buried long ago. Harold gives Dan 2 options: fight or disappear. He warns that Dan can't fight the CIA alone and can't drag his daughter into it. He also adds that Dan has grown very old and makes silly mistakes like leaving the silencer of the intruder attached to the gun. He tells Dan to disappear forever and never contact Emily again, as he will be presumed dead. With no other choice, Dan calls Emily. He tells her he has to disappear for good, but she begs him not to do that. She urges him to fight for his freedom. Dan explains that he has done many bad things and that people will go through her to get to him. However, Emily says she's not afraid, and Dan ends the call. Afterward, Dan leaves the main road and disappears. Harold, believing Dan will obey, is relieved. But to everyone's shock, Dan attacks the agents and kills one of them instantly. He fights with the second agent, but he's subdued and captured. The agent drives Dan to the airfield, but Dan breaks free of his restraints and manages to crash the car. As they struggle inside the car, Dan's dogs arrive and kill the agent. Dan calls Harold and warns him that he will kill anyone Harold sends after him. He then calls Emily and tells her he has decided to fight back. The next morning, Harold remembers a conversation he had with Dan in Afghanistan. Dan had asked Harold for more weapons, but but Harold was angry. He said Dan was fighting a war that his country had ordered him not to, taking the side of the enemy. Dan had aligned himself with Hamzad, a young rebel who wanted to free his people, even if it wasn't the way the Americans wanted. The CIA didn't agree with Dan's actions and warned him that when the time came to hunt him down, Harold would be the one to bring him in. Back in the present, Raymond tells Harold that the operation is no longer under their control. Law enforcement will handle it from now on, and Raymond will only be consulted. Meanwhile, Dan assumes a new identity and rents a house in an isolated area from a woman named Zoe. He discards everything that ties him to his old life and leaves a voice message for Emily, telling her she can find the answers about his past in Los Angeles. However, things escalate when Zoe tells Dan to get rid of the dogs or leave her house. Zoe fears that the dogs will chew on her furnitures and ruin her house. At the same time, Harold visits Morgan, the former head of the CIA and mentor for both Harold and Dan. Morgan scolds Harold for helping Dan escape. He tells Harold that if he wanted their 30-year history to remain hidden, he should have ended Dan's life. Morgan gives Harold a hitman's contact information and warns him that whatever Hamzad has planned for Dan is far worse for Harold. Over the past 30 years, Hamzad has developed a plan and built resources to force the U.S. government to hand Dan over. Dan is now the key to Hamzad's master plan. Next, Dan goes to Zoe's kitchen and cooks a delicious meal for her. He explains that his dogs are well behaved and listen to his commands. The food melts Zoe's heart, and seeing the dogs standing still for hours, she changes her mind and allows Dan to stay. Taking Morgan's advice, Harold heads back to the office, which shocks everyone. It's only been a few weeks since he lost his son and daughter-in-law, but Harold has a burning issue at hand that needs to be resolved. Harold soon learns that over the years, Dan has taken 6 different identities. Despite this, Harold tells his team to focus on finding Dan's daughter, as she is the key to tracking him down. One night, Zoe asks Dan to go on a dinner date, and he agrees to avoid suspicion. Over dinner, they talk about Dan's late wife, who died of Huntington's disease 5 years ago. Zoe shares that she divorced her husband after he cheated and that her son has been ignoring her. When they return from dinner, they are stopped by a couple of policemen who ask them to step out of the vehicle and confirm their identities. Dan briefly considers killing them, but the officers let them go when Zoe tells them that Dan is her husband. That night, Dan and Zoe spend the night together, both experiencing a form of love they never felt for some time. Meanwhile, Raymond visits Angela, one of Harold's most trusted agents. He reveals the true nature of the case they are working on. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a man named Hamzad became known for protecting his country. He had help from Dan, who eliminated multiple Soviet soldiers with his sniper skills. Harold also helped, which became a huge scandal, since both men were American spies working against the Soviets. Raymond tells Angela that Harold is willing to go to any lengths to hide this evidence and asks her to work with him instead. However, Angela refuses. She says Harold helped her stay in the FBI and taught her everything she knows, so she will never betray him. The next day, Angela informs Harold that she has found Dan's daughter, Emily, but she committed suicide years ago. Harold is shocked by this news, as he believes she was the key to finding Dan. Angela also tells him that Raymond visited her earlier and mentioned Hamzad. She asks Harold what the case is really about, but Harold simply says that all he wants is to end this long story, and she shouldn't worry about it. After the conversation, Harold calls the hitman named Julian, whom Morgan gave him the contact for. He tells Julian that he has located Dan. It turns out that the officers from the previous night have reported Dan, and Harold has identified him because Zoe lied about him being her husband. The next morning, Harold tells the FBI that he has located Dan and that the SWAT team will make contact in 3 hours, but he has already arranged for Julian to reach there before them. Raymond is surprised that Harold has found Dan, but still suspects Harold's involvement, so he keeps a close watch on him. The story then shifts back to Afghanistan. Dan goes to speak with Hamzad after Harold agrees to provide the guns. Hamzad is suspicious because the U.S. has made it clear they won't help, and he questions why Dan is doing this. Dan tells him that he came to kill Soviets, but Hamzad sees through the lie. Dan finally admits that he is acting without CIA approval, secretly bringing in supplies because he believes Hamzad should lead the fight, not someone controlled by the agency. Hamzad then tells Dan that if he truly wants to help, he must convince his wife, Balor, to join them. In the present, Dan feels like he needs to move because last night, Zoe told the police that he is her husband. He asks her why she did that, thinking he needed her protection. Zoe explains that she believed the police were looking for him. Dan then tells her only a part of his story and asks her to head to Montana with him. He tries to convince her that even if she doesn't want to go, nothing will happen to her because she hasn't done anything wrong. Just then, Emily calls Dan. After learning what happened with Zoe, she talks to her on the phone. Emily tells Zoe to trust Dan, explaining that he never told her his real identity until she turned 18, and the only identity that matters is the one she knows him by. The camera then shifts to reveal that Emily and Angela are the same person. After their conversation, Zoe tells Dan to leave and she heads out to go to the bank. However, while she's in her car, she hears the dogs barking and decides to return to the house. There, she is shocked to find Dan fighting with the hitman, Julian. Julian takes the upper hand and knocks Dan out, but Zoe opens the door for the dogs and they attack Julian, giving Dan just enough time to shoot him. Zoe then tells Dan she's going to tell the police what happened, but he tells her that he can't let that happen. Meanwhile, the SWAT team is just 15 minutes away. In the office, Angela talks to Harold about Raymond, mentioning that no one really likes him because he asks too many questions. She finds it strange that Raymond was assigned to the case, especially when Hamzad has so much leverage over them. Just then, Harold is called to the office because they have eyes on the target. Dan, however, drives to a road lined with trees to avoid the drone's sight. He then takes out his sniper rifle and aims at the drone, but as he gathers his breath to focus on his target, he remembers his first encounter with Balur, where she questioned what kind of experience he could bring to their cause. She told him that even with the guns he promised, he would only help by shooting Soviet officers from 200 yards. Dan corrected her, saying he could shoot moving targets from 1,000 yards, which surprised her. Back in the present, Dan takes aim at the drone and effortlessly shoots it down. Raymond, angry, speaks to Harold and Angela. He tells them that he knows Harold helped Dan escape the first time and that this latest escape isn't a coincidence either. Raymond says he's reporting this to his superior, but Harold stops him and asks how he managed to get this case in the first place. Harold suspects that Hamzad put Raymond in charge because he knows Raymond will dig deep, and that's exactly what Hamzad wants. Raymond then asks Harold what he really knows to be dragged so deep into this mess. Harold begins explaining. He tells Raymond that 30 years ago, Dan ran away with Hamzad's wife, and Harold helped him do it. However, when Harold starts speaking ill of Balur, Angela gets angry and stops him. Instead, she convinces the group to work together to figure out what questions Hamzad is asking. She believes the answers lie with Hamzad himself and asks Raymond to contact him. Meanwhile, the SWAT team arrives at the house but finds nothing except clear signs of a fight. Raymond tells Angela that he now suspects her too, after her earlier comment. He says he will arrange the meeting with Hamzad, but he will also dig into her background. However, it's revealed that Julian is still alive, just injured from the earlier confrontation. Next, Dan drives into the woods and reflects on his past conversations with Balur. Back then, she didn't trust him because he was American and believed Americans were only interested in bending the war to their own advantage. However, Dan's promised guns arrive via airdrop as they talk, and he tells her to trust him because he is no monster. The scene then shifts to the present, where Dan opens the back of his car and Zoe steps out. He explains that the man he encountered earlier was a professional, and these people will do anything to find him. Keeping her safe is now a priority. He tells her to call her son because the FBI will be asking him questions. But when Zoe calls her son, he keeps ignoring her calls. Realizing this is her chance to feel alive again, she decides to go to Montana with Dan. After 3 days, no one can figure out where Dan and Zoe have gone, and Harold starts to get worried. Meanwhile, Harold, Raymond, and Angela are scheduled to meet with Hamzad's lawyer the next day. It's bad news when she finds out that Dan has slipped away from their grasp. Harold then asks Angela why she reacted the way she did when he mentioned Hamzad's wife earlier. Angela tells him that no one talks about her, but she might hold the key to solving the case. That night, Angela calls Dan, posing as Emily, and asks why Hamzad wants him so desperately. Dan responds that there's no mystery. It's just a simple grudge because he stole Balur from him, who then became Dan's wife. The next morning, Dan secures a new identity for himself and Zoe, now posing as his wife. He assures her that he will compensate her well once everything is over, but Zoe is still angry at him for dragging her into this. They head to their new home, where they will stay for a while. Dan reflects on the last time he was there, when he was with Balur, and memories flood his mind. He recalls how Balur once returned home, injured from a Soviet attack on a village. Hamzad wanted to retaliate to send a message, but Balur argued they would need at least 300 men and enough supplies for a month. Dan, however, suggested going solo to capture their commander, striking fear into the Soviets by doing so. Back in the present, Julian calls Harold and tells him that he failed the mission because Dan knew he was being targeted and was already at the door. Julian hints that there might be a mole in their operation, but Harold continues to act naturally. He then heads to the scheduled meeting with Hamzad's lawyer, Nina, and discusses Dan and Balur, a story Nina is unaware of. Harold tells Nina he has information and insight that goes beyond what she might have expected, urging her to contact Hamzad. However, Harold notices a change in Angela's expression when he mentions Balur's name, and Nina's expression also shifts, who thought she knew everything about Hamzad's deepest secret. Next, the story shifts back in time to Afghanistan, where Dan is heading toward the Soviet camp to carry out his mission. Along the way, Hamzad's sister, Khadija, tells Dan that she is surprised to see Hamzad being influenced by him, as he was only influenced by Balur. What's even stranger is that Dan and Balur had agreed to have a bloodless revenge against the Soviets. However, Dan tells her she's wrong and that tonight will be full of blood. Shortly after, Dan and Khadija arrive at the Soviet camp, where they successfully capture the Soviet commander. In the present, Dan meets with the CEO of a powerful company, and it's revealed that Dan is actually the owner of the company, which he created under another identity. Dan tells the CEO, Zach, that he wants to make an equity investment in another company to attract the attention of its Director General, Suleiman. However, Zach is skeptical about the deal and believes it's too risky. Back in the past, in Afghanistan, Dan delivers the captured Soviet commander to Hamzad and Balur, and it is revealed that the commander is none other than Suleiman himself. The story then shifts to Harold, Raymond, and Angela, where Nina brings shocking news. After hearing Harold's comments, Hamzad has given Harold a chance to get on a plane and meet him. If Harold refuses, Hamzad will hold him responsible for losing Dan twice. During a break, Angela steps outside to call Dan and inform him that Harold is considering boarding the plane. She tells Dan that if Harold goes, she must join him, as he is growing suspicious of her. Dan tries to convince Angela to abandon everything and meet him, but Angela refuses, saying she won't rest until Hamzad is gone. Meanwhile, Zoe spends the day learning about Dan's other identity, the one where he owns a company and has a wife still alive. She tells him that as his wife, she wants a divorce. She claims to have leverage over him and demands half of everything to avoid trouble. Zoe threatens that if he doesn't send her half of the money within 2 hours, an automatic message will be sent to the financial team and attorneys letting them know about her intention of divorcing him. Dan becomes furious, goes to his bedroom, and then returns with Zoe's alias bank account and his bank details. He tells her to take half of everything, but he will never return to her life because Emily is in danger. Zoe is confused by how easily Dan gave up, and Dan explains that money is just a means to protect his family and he doesn't care about it. He begs her to stop this and go to Morocco with him because that is where the plane is taking Emily. On the plane, Harold confronts Angela for lying to him, accusing her of being Emily. He blames her for deceiving him, but Emily defends herself, explaining that she has been loyal to him all these years. Harold demands that she lead him to Dan or reveal his location. Emily refuses, saying that Dan gave her life and Harold gave her purpose, so she can't betray either of them. She is frustrated because Harold is asking her to separate two of the most important figures in her life. However, Harold tells her that from now on, she must decide who she wants to be because that is the only thing that matters. Back in time, in Afghanistan, Suleiman is being tortured by Hamzad, and Dan wants to leave to gather more intel because the Soviets might have changed their strategy. However, Balur tells him to wait because leaving now could ruin everything they've built, and she promises to explain more later. Dan grows suspicious of her but agrees to meet her at midnight in secret. When the time comes, Balur meets Dan and reveals an important secret that she is working for the Soviets. She's only doing it because she wants Hamzad to rule Afghanistan when all this is over, and she is only giving them information about their local rivals. After hearing this, Dan urges Balur to tell Hamzad everything, but she resists, saying there's more he wouldn't understand. She explains that the Soviets have discovered that a foreign prospecting crew found a mineral deposit of copper, lithium, and uranium buried in the hills. The Soviets desperately want access to it, but they don't know where it is. Balur tells him that she knows the location, but she refuses to tell Hamzad because giving him this much power so quickly would destroy him. Dan warns her that she's playing a dangerous game, but Balur tells him that's why she wants him in this with her. In the present, Dan shares everything with Zoe, but she is shocked to learn that she is impersonating a woman who toyed with empires. Dan then drives to an animal shelter to leave his 2 dogs under care while he's in Morocco. He asks Zoe to be their caretaker if he never makes it out alive. Then, they head to Zach's place to convince him to close the deal to get closer to Suleiman. Zoe insists on talking to Zach alone as Dan's presumed wife, and eventually she convinces Zach to do the deal. Afterward, they board a plane to Morocco to meet with Suleiman. That night, Raymond receives instructions from the CIA chief to follow orders, which he will get through a phone call. He then gets a call from none other than Morgan, who is putting together a team to put an end to this mess once and for all. Morgan meets with Julian and tells him about the mole in Harold's office, Emily. Morgan admits that he put Emily in the FBI because Dan asked him to, and he wanted to be a good father figure to both Dan and Harold. In the morning, Harold and Emily land in Tunis, the last location Dan and Balour stopped at before entering the United States. They are taken to a record room where they are tested to find sensitive information about Dan and Balour. Harold discovers a flight record from 1987 showing that Dan and Balour flew to the U.S., including their seat numbers. Harold tells Nina, but she isn't pleased. She tells him that the papers containing every dirty thing he did will be published, ruining his career forever. Harold gets furious because there's nothing he can do, but Emily reassures him. She tells him they can tell a different story once they kill Hamzad. She explains that Harold can claim he was framed and went rogue until he found the truth. She suggests they work with Dan because he is already planning to kill Hamzad. Next, Harold calls his wife Cheryl, but she has already heard about what he did. She tries to convince him to come back so they can settle this with a good lawyer and that Morgan is there to help him. Harold then speaks to Morgan on the phone and accuses him of using him by planting a mole in his office. However, Morgan offers Harold a way out. If Harold gives up Angela to disappear, all his problems will be solved, and maybe she could be saved too. The next day, Raymond, Julian, and his friend Mike are in Morocco, waiting for Morgan's orders. Meanwhile, Dan and Zoe arrive at a hotel to rest before meeting Suleiman. After some time, they head to a bank where Dan receives an encrypted message from Emily. She confirms she is fine and coming to his location. However, their communication is spotted by Harold, and Emily finally opens up to him, explaining how she and Dan stayed in touch over the years through phone calls. It's been so long since she saw him in person, and she even missed her mother's funeral to keep their secret safe. All the sacrifices they made show how deeply they love each other and how far they will go to protect one another. Next, Dan and Zoe board a boat to attend a private party hosted by Suleiman. Zoe is skeptical that Suleiman will recognize him after all these years. However, Dan recalls a memory of saving Suleiman for the sake of Balour, and he's confident Suleiman will remember him. But freeing Suleiman came at a cost. That morning, Hamzad told Dan that he knows Balour sneaks out at night for reasons he doesn't understand, but freeing Suleiman wasn't one of them. Hamzad knows that Balour understands the consequences of her actions. In the present, Dan writes a note on a piece of paper and sends it to Suleiman. Suleiman immediately recognizes Dan and invites him inside his house. Meanwhile, Harold and Emily land in Morocco and spot secret agents in the distance. Harold explains their identities to Emily, but she already knows as she was the one who called the agents to escort him safely back to the U.S. She tells him that his grandson, Henry, called her about a strange old man visiting their house. She suspects that a high-ranking official is planning something dangerous for them. To her disbelief, Harold reveals that the old man was Morgan, and he wanted Emily instead of him, but Harold refused to cooperate. Despite all the trouble Emily has caused him, Harold admits he still can't let her go. Emily tells him that he should take Morgan's offer because she can handle the situation, and others are involved too. Harold then tells her that Dan's plan to kill Hamzad won't work because Hamzad is a ghost in Afghanistan. Emily smiles and replies that Harold is underestimating Dan once again. She also tells him that he can still have a happy ending to his story while she pursues her own. Harold finally agrees, deciding to leave her behind so she can disappear. As Harold walks toward the men, he passes by Julian, whom he doesn't recognize. However, when he sees Raymond, he realizes something is wrong. He runs back to find Emily, but she's already gone. Meanwhile, Zoe is waiting for Dan to return when Nina approaches her. Nina knows about her true identity. At the same time, Dan is talking to Suleiman about Hamzad, and it's possible that Suleiman might be the next target on the list since he recruited Balour as a Soviet spy. Suleiman, however, denies recruiting Balour. He reveals that she was his lover when he was a student in Moscow. After learning that they both had responsibilities to their respective countries, Suleiman realized they couldn't be together anymore. He challenges Dan, saying that even though both he and Hamzad married Balour, she never truly belonged to either of them. The light mood quickly vanishes when Suleiman mentions that Nina came to him before Dan. Nina wants him to hand over Dan in exchange for gaining Hamzad's favor. However, Dan reacts swiftly, killing Suleiman's men but sparing Suleiman's life for the second time. Meanwhile, Zoe is outside talking to Nina when a man tries to abduct her. Dan comes to her rescue, and they escape the party, boarding the same boat they arrived in. When they land on the shore, they are met by Harold, who has arrived with his men, and Dan comes face to face with him for the first time in over 30 years. Harold tells Dan that Emily was taken from him by Morgan, but assures him they will get her back one way or another. Meanwhile, Mike feels uneasy as the trio waits for further instructions from Morgan on what to do with Emily as they are keeping her hostage. Zoe then shares her thoughts with Dan, telling him that when she mentioned Hamzad to Nina, she sensed tension between them. Dan explains that Hamzad doesn't tolerate even the slightest disloyalty, especially after what happened with Balur. Harold then explains Morgan's plan. Dan must board a plane to meet Hamzad, or else Emily will be placed on that plane instead. Dan feels trapped, like it's a checkmate move because he can never risk Emily's life. He reluctantly agrees to the plan. However, Zoe pleads with him to have an escape plan, but Dan insists that this is the end of his story. Dan recalls a moment from his past when Hamzad confronted him and Balur about helping Suleiman escape. Balur reveals that some things are better left hidden, which only made Hamzad angrier. Then she confesses the truth that she had been feeding the Soviets information to weaken their rivals while strengthening them. She declares her commitment and loyalty to Hamzad as his wife, but Hamzad believes she was hiding something else. Dan tries to cover for her, but Balur insists on telling the truth. She reveals that the Soviets were in Afghanistan because they believe there is valuable mineral ore, and she alone knows its location. Hamzad is furious, unable to understand why she would hide something like this from him. Balur explains that once he knew, he would be consumed by the desire to possess it. She believes she assessed the balance for his rule, his kindness for his cruelty, his ruthlessness for his generosity. Hamzad demands to know where the minerals were, believing that he, the only man capable of wielding that power, deserves to control it. He gave her the night to think it over and decide by morning. Dan then calls Harold, informing him that things are falling apart between Hamzad and Balur, and he urgently needs Harold's help to rescue her. Harold can already sense the weight of Dan's request, knowing that if Hamzad wins, he will stop at nothing to get his hands on Balur and the information she holds. Dan reassures Harold, insisting that Hamzad can't win the war without Balur, and urges him to arrange transport to the U.S. as quickly as possible. However, Harold believes that even this might not guarantee their safety. He tells Dan that he wants him to kill Hamzad to ensure their survival. In the present, Harold and Dan are on their way to the plane that Hamzad has prepared. Harold asks Dan what happened during the flight from Tunis to the U.S. 30 years ago. He explains that he was tested back then, but his knowledge wasn't enough. He wants to know why Dan didn't kill Hamzad like he was supposed to. Dan refuses to reveal anything further, but Harold insists, saying Emily will do anything to find out more about her mother's past. Dan then explains that after his conversation with Suleiman the day before, he began to question Balur's true motives. Balur met Suleiman when they were just teenagers and used him to help with the war. She recruited him even before they knew what their futures would hold. At the time, when he was helping her, he felt like he was aiding a brave and noble woman. But now, he feels like he was just another piece in Balur's exit strategy. Dan tells Harold that if Emily knows this uncertainty, it will cause a lot of unrest. He asks Harold to just tell her that her mother loved her more than anything. Meanwhile, Mike's suspicion becomes a reality when he realizes that they are surrounded by some men. He informs Julian and Raymond, and they agree it's best to move. Raymond calls Harold to inform him that they're making a move because they are surrounded. Dan suspects that Hamzad is behind this because he's trying to get his hands on Emily. Harold and his team quickly head to Raymond's location once he drops a pin. Meanwhile, Raymond wakes Emily and they prepare for the worst. Julian takes the lead and starts eliminating Hamzad's men. Once the area is cleared, Mike, Raymond, and Emily jump into a van to escape. But as they drive through a crowded area, a woman steps in front of their car and she is revealed to be none other than Khadija. She quickly pulls out her gun and shoots Mike. Next, Harold's team receives orders to return to the airfield and deliver Dan to the plane, just as originally planned. However, both Harold and Dan refuse to follow the orders and are pursued by their own men. Dan then uses his expertise to shoot at the cars on their tail, killing them all. But when they reach Raymond's location in a hurry, it's already too late. Khadija and Hamzad's men have killed both Mike and Raymond and taken Emily with them. With everything falling apart, Dan finally tells Harold what happened that night he escaped with Balur. Dan went to kill Hamzad, just like Harold had told him to, but he couldn't do it. Dan couldn't pull the trigger because Hamzad's baby daughter was watching everything. Dan and Balur had wanted to tell Harold to prepare a third seat on that flight, but they feared the risk was too great. Hamzad never wanted revenge on Dan for taking his wife, nor did he want to know the location of the precious minerals that could make his country rich. All Hamzad wanted was what was truly taken from him that night, his successor, the one he wanted to build a better kingdom with, the one he had been searching for all these years, his precious daughter, Emily, or as her true name is, Parwana.